Right, so you will have probably heard in the news recently about sanctions being placed on the West's seemingly eternal enemy, Iran. It's been in the news over the last few days after being accused of supplying missiles to Russia. Russia, of course, being subject to sanctions over the war in Ukraine, and anyone seen to be aiding and abetting them is in violation of those sanctions and therefore becomes subject to international sanctions themselves. Iran have denied this, though. Now contrast this with news you will not have heard a thing about in Western mainstream media regarding an admission by an Israeli to be supplying aircraft parts to Russia and having been doing it over the last year from facilities he owns not just in Israel but the United States as well. So why not any sanctions for Israel in which case, and should the US not also sanction itself then? Right, so this is all a little bit embarrassing for the US and Western Europe, isn't it? An Israeli living in the US has pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges for violating export restrictions imposed on Russia. But we're all very loudly proclaiming Iran guilty of doing this and sanctioning them into the floor for violating said sanctions against Russia, when it is happening internationally via a guy living right under the US's own nose, so to speak, in their own country. Now, I pondered to myself for a while when considering this story for a video as to whether this ought to result in sanctions being imposed on Israel itself. And that seemed to me at the time probably a bit of a stretch, all things considered. However, I also thought, well, what if this guy wasn't Israeli but was Iranian? Would the West just come down on this guy responsible, or would they take the opportunity to impose such restrictions on Iran as a whole over it? And under no circumstances do I believe Iran and Israel would be judged on the same terms equally here. Israel is a Western ally, after all, and Iran is the boogeyman. Well, the accusation against Iran, of course, is on charges more severe than this. However, they have denied them. They have said they have not supplied short-range missiles to Russia, as has been the accusation. And the new sanctions levelled against Iran, which have incidentally not come solely from the US, again, it is acting through European proxies as well. And I say that quite deliberately, because I don't believe for one moment that France, Germany and us here in the UK would have slapped new economic sanctions on Iran without the US telling us to do so first. Who honestly believes we have independent foreign policy in this country from the US anymore? Here's an excerpt from Al Jazeera, and it includes one crucial paragraph at the end that I want you to keep in mind. France, Germany and the United Kingdom announced the sanctions earlier the same day after the United States formally accused Iran of supplying the weapons to Moscow. The measures revoke bilateral deals for providing air services to Iran and impose sanctions on flag carrier Iran Air that will restrict its ability to fly to Europe. In addition, we will pursue the designations of significant entities and individuals involved with Iran's ballistic missile program and the transfer of ballistic missiles and other weapons to Russia, the three European states said. We will pursue significant entities and individuals involved with the ballistic program and transfer of weapons to Russia. There's part of the justification by these three European countries to apply sanctions to the entire nation of Iran. So maybe I'm not being overly churlish when I considered whether Israel itself should be sanctioned for what their man in the US has done then. I'm coming to this more in a moment though. First, I want to raise another point about why these three European nations specifically may have been the only ones imposing sanctions here, because if Iran can be accused, whether true or not, and Iran have called the basis for their actions baseless, based on faulty intelligence, amounting to economic terrorism even, but if they can be accused successfully, if this can be sold to the UK public, for instance, then there ends up being a larger justification for what the West already wants to do, which is allow Ukraine to use our Storm Shadow long-range missiles against targets behind Russia's border. Certainly the allegedly liberal Guardian was very much softening up the public with its piece from the other day, opining on this. Here's a short example of how they laid it on thick. Russia has received new deadly ballistic missiles from Iran for use in Ukraine and is likely to use them, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced on Tuesday in London as he prepared to travel with the UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy to Kiev. The news, confirmed by the US for the first time and seen as of huge significance to the battlefield balance ahead of Ukraine's difficult winter, led the US and Europe to impose new sanctions on Iran, so apparently slamming the door on the prospect of a rapprochement between the new reformist Iranian government and the West. The move may also add to the pressure on the US to end its restrictions on Ukraine using British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles to strike targets deep inside Russia and not just in occupied parts of Ukraine. Blinken says jump, Lammy and co say how high. But we're only taking the US's word for it. The only source The Guardian uses for this is Antony Blinken himself. America's biggest Zionist is seemingly the only source of this evidence against Iran. And the end goal spelled out in the last paragraph is all about those Storm Shadow missiles. We now have to contrast this with this story of the Israeli who has admitted to supplying Russia, admitted it, with military parts. And of course you have to dig into foreign media and alternative media to find anything on this. It's a good job I rummaged through so much of it, looking for stories nobody else covers, really. The best coverage of this story came from news outlet Israel Hayom, which goes to show how poorly this story has been covered. It pretty much hasn't been outside of Israeli outlets at all. But this story centres around a chap called Gal Haimovich, who owns an international freight forwarding company, which was part of a group of companies. So this is a small chunk of what could eventually be a much larger story, who together conspired to ship avionics parts to Russia via third parties, some of which apparently had missile technology applications. Parts could be leaving any of Haimovich's hubs in the US or Israel, supposedly headed for a given destination, but when delivered to a third-party company, the destination ends up being changed and rerouted through to Russia instead. Here's an excerpt from Israel Hayom's piece explaining this further. According to court documents, Haimovich owned an international freight forwarding company that was part of a group of companies operating in various countries, including the United States and Israel. Between March 2022 and May 2023, Haimovich allegedly facilitated the export of aircraft parts and avionics, some with missile technology applications, from the US to Russian customers through third-party transshippers. The scheme involved deceiving US-based manufacturers and suppliers about the ultimate destination of the goods. In one instance, Haimovich arranged for the shipment of an air data module to Russia for Siberia Airlines, S7 Airlines, in August 2022, falsely informing the US supplier that the parts was destined for the Maldives. So for a year, beginning literally the month after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this guy Haimovich, for his part at least, regardless of however big this Russian avionics supply ring might be, chose to aid Russia in supplying parts for planes. While the US and the UK and others bemoaned the severity of Iranian supplies to Russia, which Iran denies, and for which I'd quite like to see the evidence of, rather than just take Antony Blinken's word for it, Israel, or an Israeli at least, has actually admitted to doing this in a US court. Where individually accused Iranians have led, in part at least, to the sanctions now imposed on their country, should that not now be the case against Israel and actually the US as well, given that was where Haimovich was based and where some of the parts going to Russia were actually originating from? How can we take America seriously when it makes accusations of others for supplying Russia in violation of sanctions they are already under, yet they failed to spot it happening for well over a year in their own country? Little wonder there's no coverage of this story that I can find at all coming from a US source. If Iran has been sanctioned for this despite denials, how can Israel and the US not be following an actual admission based on what we've discussed here? If international law and the sanctity and legitimacy of sanctions themselves not be undermined by there being two sets of rules, one set for American allies it seems and another set for everyone else. Haimovich is due for sentencing on November 22nd. Let's see if this story gets any more attention between now and then. Meanwhile, big questions need asking of Western politicians about all of this, don't they? Meanwhile, here in the UK, Keir Starmer has been champing at the bit to let Ukraine use those Storm Shadow missiles against Russia more directly. And now it looks like the person who can actually assent to that happening isn't actually Starmer, but it's Joe Biden. You remember ever voting for him? It really is time we took control of our own foreign policy again here in the UK, isn't it? Because Biden is painting a target on our backs for Putin, not himself. Because where he seems set to give permission for Ukraine to use our missiles for those Russian strikes, he won't let them use US ordnance. I can't think why. Get the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.